everyone, my name is Michelle Hughes and I'm presenting my real-world risk management project. For this project, I chose the subject of the UDI device marking. So for those of you that are not familiar with UDI, it was a final rule and put into law in September of 2013. It was issued by the Food and Drug Administration. UDI stands for Unique Device Identifier. It requires most medical devices distributed in the United States to carry a UDI. The main goal of the UDI is to improve the quality of information in the medical device adverse reporting. It also helps the FDA identify product problems more quickly and to target recalls, and all while improving patient safety, which is usually the main goal of the FDA anyway. So the UDI consists of a device identifier and a production identifier. A device identifier is a mandatory fixed portion of the UDI, also known as the UPN or UPC, so it's like part of the barcode of your product. Production identifier is a variable number consisting of a batch or a lot or a serial number depending on your device and its expiration date. So there's another part of UDI that's going to be required called a Global Unique Device Identification Database, or the good IDE. That's what my company is calling it for its acronym. To store its goal is to store public information about your medical device data and its associated UDI. So there's a bunch of data elements around this database. There's around 60 that include regulatory information, labeling data, your sterilization method, measurements of the device, and various other information that all tie around this UDI for your particular device. Another requirement for UDI as well is the date format. They're requiring the expiration of your product to have the year, month, and date in the format that's listed on the slide. So the 4-digit year, 2-digit month, and 2-digit date. One of the main reasons why I'm discussing UDI is that one of the main requirements is reusable devices that require reprocessing or re-sterilization require an on-device marking. So an on-device marking of that actual UDI, that huge long number, the device identifier and the production identifier across your device. As you can see, in this slide, this is a picture of a label, and at the bottom of the label, then the red circled portion, you can see the complete UDI. This is just an example I got from the FDA website. It's very similar to how most medical device packaging labels, at least from my company, look. And you can also see that the date format up in the middle portion of the label includes the proper format of what the UDI requirements is going to be going forward. So focusing more on device marking requirement, that's going to focus on all usable devices requiring reprocessing or re-sterilization between each use, because the rationale is that reusable devices at some point during their life, could be even after the first use, will get separated from the original packaging and you'll lose all that UDI information. You lose that barcode. So the idea is to device mark it so that you can still track it in case there's a recall or an adverse event that is associated with that particular reusable device. There are some exceptions that may be accepted. That's part of the rule, that there are some exceptions if you can prove that UDI device marking will impact the safety of the device with the patient. And there's also some exceptions about if it's too small. Sometimes if it's like really tiny and you're not able to put the UDI in a good readable format. Okay, some of the supply chain issues with device marking. What's the device marking source? That's a huge question, especially for my company. But it can also be a huge problem for small organizations in a certain company, because like currently my current company has thousands of reusable devices. So we're trying to figure out if as a legal manufacturer we want to take on the device marking process or have a supplier do it. And we also want to figure out what during what process in the manufacturing will this UDI be etched? Will it be on a component before the assembly or on the final assembly? It's all huge questions for us, and it's based a lot on risk and cost, and currently we're still trying to figure out that part. I know a lot of other companies are probably looking at the same thing. So FDA's UDI final rule does not specify how this UDI should be applied, so it's kind of open-ended, and there's no real guidance around this device marking requirement. So some of the risks are dealing with many suppliers, implementing an unfamiliar process with a lot of these suppliers, or with us as a current manufacturer. Another risk is slowing down production to conduct this extra step in the manufacturing process. So the risk management technique that I chose for my project was for this UDI device marking supplier issue was FMEA risk management technique, since it is the most common tool used to assess risk management. So most of us are familiar with FMEA because we learned about it in Chapter 6. But a failure mode and effects analysis provides for an evaluation of potential failure modes or processes and is a likely effect on outcomes or performances. There's an emphasis on prevention of many reduced risks with using this FMEA process to reduce harm to both patients and the proposed process of device marking. So the way it works, there's there's a chart, and you have all these criteria. You have the failure mode, what could go wrong, failure causes, why would the failure happen, failure effects, what would be the consequences of those failures, and the likelihood of occurrence, you rate it from 1 to 10, 10 equaling very likely to occur. Then you also have to take in consideration the likelihood of detection of that failure from 1 to 10. Again, 10 being very likely to detect. Then you want to assess the severity of that failure. So if that failure occurs, how severe is it to the patient or to the entire process of marketing that device in the United States? Again, 10 being the most severe effect. The risk priority number is the likelihood of occurrence times the likelihood of detection times the severity of the failure occurring. So I conducted a FMEA for UDI device marking, mostly around UDI being marked by the supplier, since we're focusing mostly on supplier risk, but I also included risks on the UDI being marked by the manufacturer. So as you can see, I have my failure modes, that's in column 2. I have my potential effects of failure, then the severity, the causes of that failure, the occurrences, and any kind of current process controls that you may have in place. Since this is a brand new regulation for my company and for many other organizations around the United States, we don't have any current process controls in place. We also have the detection score and the RPN, which we talked about in the previous slide. And then I also filled in some recommended actions and the responsibility of who would be. I just put myself because this is just an example. So let's go with the first failure mode, UDI not being etched correctly on the component or the device. So one of the potential effects of that failure is the supplier will be out of compliance with the manufacturer. One of the causes is the etching process is not controlled or qualified by either the supplier or the manufacturer. Another UDI marked by a supplier failure could be the device or component reaches the manufacturer and needs to be reworked, which can delay the shipment to the customer, and meaning that the etching of the UDI did not meet the requirements or the standards of the UDI final rule. They're very similar failures for UDI being marked by the manufacturer, but it's much more riskier because going from a supplier to a manufacturer, they at least would catch it in a quality check, whereas being UDI marked by the manufacturer is automatically out of compliance with FDA regulations, and there could be a potential future audit finding or an action letter from the FDA on this device marking requirement. Again, this is because the process wasn't controlled or qualified, and that if you had to rework it, this would also delay your shipment to your customers, causing you to lose money in sales. So this is just an example. There's gonna, you could go way more in depth with this, but I just try to pick the most common failures based on a particular device and a particular supplier. You could have many more or many less failures and effects. So some of the results of the risk analysis that I conducted was that the supplier UDI direct marking process not being qualified had a severity of 8. Severity of 8 is pretty high. I chose this because this is an FDA requirement, and the manufacturer would be ultimately responsible. So that severity should be pretty high. Again, another result I had was the supplier not meeting specifications of the UDI is a severity of 9, as well as the specification not being being met by the manufacturer. Both of those could stop shipment because rework would be required, causing you to lose money and be in back order. And another result, one of my final results, was manufacturer's UDI process was not qualified. It could be a severity of 10 because the manufacturer is ultimately responsible for the UDI direct marking process. So if they don't qualify their process, and then they could have audit findings and action letters, and they could be rejected from importing or importing into the United States if they're an outside manufacturer, or even distributing completely from the United States for any devices. Your whole plant could be put on hold. So some of the practices I recommend to mitigate some of these risks is to control your UDI device marking process. Have an established supplier controls. Pick the lowest risk component to etch the UDI on before assembly of the finished device. That way you can inspect each component before you assemble in your plant, and you can reject or return to vendor the lowest risk component. So like my recommendations or examples of the lowest risk component is we have huge capital equipment. If you etched your UDI on the back panel of that equipment that may or may not have, that wouldn't have a function, it's just a piece of titanium or plastic that just kind of holds on, is just the back part of the device, you can send that back to the supplier and continue to assemble, and then once you receive the corrected back panels, you can attach them and then package and ship to customers. Another practice I'd recommend to mitigate some of these risks is to establish a UDI device marking specification around the UDI final rule by the FDA. No, the final rule by the FDA doesn't go into too much detail about device marking, but we're kind of hoping they'll issue a guidance document in the future to kind of focus around device marking. Another practice to mitigate the risk would be quality check by the manufacturer before shipment to customers. So you would quality check all your components coming in from the supplier, but you would also quality check your UDI before it leaves your plant heading to a U.S. customer. Okay, to conclude my complete project about UDI device marking, as I stated, it's a fairly new requirement since it was issued in September of 2013, and many reusable devices will not be required to be directly marked until 2018, or for Class 1 reusable devices until 2020. So manufacturers have time to assess their risk. Like mine, they will not only assess their risk, but they will also assess the cost and the time of whether they want to use a supplier to do this process, or just go with doing it ourselves. Sometimes it may be easier just to do it ourselves because we can control the process easier, and even if it costs more money, we know that the time associated with sending components that are not in spec back and forth to the supplier may not work very well. We may not be able to get our shipments to customers in time. I really don't have anything to reference based on my conclusion. because UDI is so fairly new, and there's no guidance document around specifically direct marking process. But if anyone's interested, I've attached the final rule website, where you can review all the requirements around UDI. It talks about the database and the date format and the device marking and exceptions to the rules and various other requirements that I didn't cover in this presentation, but feel free to look at this website, check it out, and thank you. And this slide is just my references. Thanks again for listening.